Thanks so much, Nick. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thanks very much to the organizers of this quite amazing event, especially to Jim Matlack and our hosts, John and Mary Alice Bird, who've made this a really pleasant experience. Yesterday afternoon, when our military colleagues were putting the case for making education a central national priority, I couldn't help but think back to the late 1970s when there was a debate going on in the Carter administration. The National Education Association, one of really the largest teacher organization in the country, had been pushing for years to create a separate education department to take it out of health, education, and welfare and give it its own standing. Al Shanker, the legendary leader of the other teachers organization, the American Federation of Teachers, kind of resisted that idea. He was afraid that education would be too exposed if it went by itself. And he made the argument, at least with a little bit of tongue-in-cheek, that where we really belonged was in the Department of Defense. That's where the money was. And he wanted to see a case really being made that improving education was a national security issue. And guess what? We've come there. I think the other thing that Al would have been surprised by, though, is just hard to predict in 1978 and 79 when that debate was going on. But in 1983, Nation at Risk report. Most folks in this room are old enough to remember that report, which really put education policy and the urgency of improving our education system, put it in an international context for the first time. And unlike other reports, this one actually caused a blizzard of activity. And one could argue that from 83 on, education has continued to be at least on the front burner as a significant domestic issue and now increasingly a global issue. I'm going to try to do three things in the next 30 minutes, so we do have time for Q&A. Our military colleagues may have spared you PowerPoint, but I don't think you're going to escape totally free. But this is not going to be death by PowerPoint. I'm just going to try quickly to kind of put some data in front of us so we know we've got some common information from which to speak. Then I'm going to, just in a very brief way, say some things about what I think we've learned from looking at the highest performing countries. The data I'm going to show you in a minute really comes from the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Most of you know it as an organization that really does economic studies, but it also has a small education unit. I've been privileged to work on and off with the education policy people at OECD, and OECD is the sponsor of what I think is really the most important international assessment we have that gives us evidence of how our young people are doing compared to those around the rest of the globe. PISA, as it's known, one of the things that's interesting about it is, first, it's administered to 15-year-olds in 3 subjects, kind of literacy in one's home language, mathematics, and science. But again, coming back to a comment that was made in the afternoon panel, the thing that's so striking about PISA is that it's designed deliberately to be independent of curriculum and deliberately to measure how well students are able to take what they have learned in school and apply it to novel situations. Past assessments have been designed essentially to try to figure out, to measure how well students have mastered the curriculum they've been taught. This assessment really does focus on application. And I think it has a lot to do with the kinds of qualities that we want our young people to have. When the Secretary General of OECD came to visit Secretary Arne Duncan in the Education Department back in the spring of 2010, he asked Duncan, would Duncan be willing to host the release of the 2009 PISA results at the end of the year? And the Secretary said yes, but with one proviso. Rather than simply showing us how we're doing in the horse race, we know pretty well that's not going to be of much help to us. Yes, it's useful to know how we're doing, but he said what would really be helpful is if you could at the same time give us kind of profiles of what it is that the consistently high performers do, and also take a look at what some of the most rapidly improving systems have done. OECD agreed to do that. The OECD staff asked an American organization, the National Center on Education and the Economy, that had done a lot of international comparison work here to take the lead on that, and I was lucky enough to be asked to contribute with a younger colleague at Harvard two chapters, one looking at Finland and one looking at Canada. And I'll come back and talk a little bit, not just about what we've learned from those countries, but from others in this particular study. And then at the end, I'm going to draw pretty heavily on a report called Pathways to Prosperity that I and a couple of colleagues released about a year ago that draws heavily on other OECD information. So let me start in pretty quickly with, assuming this, yes, actually moved a little too quickly. You've heard some of these numbers before, but basically this just tells us among the 34 OECD countries that we are in the middle of the pack when it comes to reading literacy. In science, we fall further behind, 17th out of 34. And you'll notice, by the way, pretty consistently up at the head of the pack, there's Finland at the top, Japan, Korea, New Zealand, Canada, and Australia are pretty close to the top there as well. In mathematics, even more distressing, 25th out of 34, Korea, Finland, Switzerland, Japan, Canada, the Netherlands, New Zealand at the front of the pack again. This, again, only Luxembourg manages to outspend us on a per-student basis. And we also have one of the countries at the top of the pack when it comes to percentage of GDP spent on education. When we look at school completion, that tells us something about achievement. But when we look at the school completion data, what you see is really pretty striking over a several-decade period. The headline is that the US rate has stagnated while most industrialized countries have improved. So in the 1960s, here we were right at the top of the pack. The 1970s, you can see we barely budged up, but other countries are now beginning to move pretty rapidly. The 1980s, again, we're stagnant. Others are going by us. 1990s, again, same thing, even more dramatic. Here, this is Korea, 27th when we started measuring, and now first in terms of percentage of high school completion rates. Here's the US, having moved from first to 13th during that period. The school dropout rate problem, I think the high school dropout rate problem is pretty well known. What's less well known, and I think what we're now beginning to pay more attention to, is how are we doing on college completion, especially completion from the equivalent of four-year institutions, at least around the world. In one decade, the US has slipped from second to 15th. One decade, 95 to 205. So I mentioned that after the 2009 results from PISA were released, that I and some colleagues were asked to do these studies. Studies is probably a somewhat inflated term. We had a very short period of time to do this work. We relied heavily on the written reports, the data we could gather from the countries that we were looking at. We interviewed a kind of cross-section of leaders, policymakers, government officials, school officials, to try to get a kind of quick sense of what the strengths were, what the strategies for reform and improvement had been in those countries. And for me, at least, there were kind of four headlines, I think. One is that by and large, the countries that have been the consistently high performers, when it comes to financing education, they do not leave the question of how much money is available to education to the vagaries of the local property tax or property wealth. They have financing systems that are focused on equity across the system, and to the degree that, that they have variations in need, the dollars tend to follow the need. Financing is typically seen as a state responsibility, not a municipal or local responsibility. Related to that, other systems tend to have much less complex governance systems, if you will. For better or worse, we have a system where authority and responsibility is distributed essentially over three levels of government, the national government, state governments, and local governments. In most higher performing countries, there's an effort at the top of the system to really be clear about goals, and often those goals get expressed in the form of They attempt to really define national standards, what it is that the countries expect their young people to know and be able to do at key grade levels. But typically the national curriculum documents, guidance documents, are much more sparse than ours. They tend to provide sort of pretty broad guidance. What are the core concepts at a particular grade level? But they leave an awful lot of discretion to people at the building level, at the school level. There's much, much less machinery sitting between the state, kind of setting broad goals, providing resources, and the schools where people have enough confidence in principals and teachers to give them the kind of authority, autonomy, responsibility to figure out how, given their local situation, to best tailor their programs to meet the needs of their students and their community. No one else has the challenge, if you will, of operating with roughly 15,000 locally elected school boards. And it's hard to say this in a state with a very strong tradition of local control. But the challenge of trying to get a kind of a coherent, aligned system where everybody understands where the system is trying to head and where the balance between central direction and local autonomy, that's what I think most other countries over time that have consistently high performance have figured out to do. A third element really has to do with incentives. And here again, I think one of the things that's striking is when you look, and I'll say a few words about the US in response to these other kind of features of higher performing systems. But to the degree that there are incentives in the system, the incentives really focus particularly on young people in high school. The question of how you persuade young people to work hard and take school seriously, in other countries there are real consequences for performance, and the consequences fall primarily on students as they exit high school, because the kinds of examinations that most systems have at the end of high school, they tend to be much richer systems of assessment than we have. Often they run for a full week. They're often a combination of kind of oral and written work, essay work, not multiple choice assessments. They are externally assessed or graded. So the teacher, in a sense, is the ally and coach of the student to help them do well. But young people understand that how well they do on those end of high school assessments really will have a lot to do with the kinds of opportunities that are now open to them, whether they're moving on to the university or the labor market or some combination of both. And finally, and I think far and away the most important lesson from looking at what other countries do, is the way they recruit, select, train, develop, and support teachers. In Finland, there are 10 applicants for every spot in a teacher preparation program in the country. And this, by the way, did not kind of happen overnight. Finland made a deliberate decision 20, 25 years ago to move teacher training from what had been a separate set of institutions into their universities, in part for status reasons, and to send a signal that teaching was obviously at least as important as any other profession. If you are good enough to be able to get through a pretty rigorous kind of examination system, if you will, to become a teacher, which consists not simply of your performance in high school, but interviews, additional kind of written work, a kind of assessment to see to what degree you've got the kind of belief system and kind of personal attributes that people think will make you an effective teacher. You then move into a 5-year training program, which has a strong clinical component. Every teacher training institution, every one of the 8 universities in the country has affiliations with schools that are specifically regular public schools, but they are training centers for teachers as well. Everyone at the end of the 5 years has to write a kind of research-based mini dissertation, if you will, and culminating in a master's degree. There are no alternative pathways into teaching, no shortcuts. Teaching is seen as a profession that requires rigorous preparation and support. And the trade-off is, again, if you really are going to devolve a lot of decision-making to the school level. Obviously, you have to have a lot of confidence in the quality of the teaching force. And you need to create the conditions in which teachers really will feel that they are respected and trusted and have enough control over their working environment to do what they think is in the best interests of children. If you contrast that system with the US system, think about the kind of the four priorities that the Obama administration, Secretary Duncan, has set first in the Race to the Top competition, and then more recently again in the waivers that have just been granted to states to give them more flexibility relief, if you will, from some of the requirements of the No Child Left Behind Act. And I should say I'm an admirer of Secretary Duncan. I think he's really, on balance, done a really wonderful job. There are kind of four priorities in this administration strategy. The first one is to support what essentially has been a state bottom-up development, which is the move toward common core, so-called common core state standards, where over 40, I think it's now something like 44 or 45 states have come together and agreed that the notion of continuing to have each state set its own standards, develop its own assessments, develop its own definition of proficiency simply does not make sense. And so in that regard, you can see the US actually moving in the direction of higher performing countries where there are typically common national standards. And I should say the organization that I ran for its first few years, called Achieve, was an organization that was basically set up by a bipartisan group of governors and corporate leaders to help states figure out how to come at this business of developing standards and how to benchmark their standards not only against what other states were doing, but against what other nations were doing. And I think that the Common Core standards have an awful lot of promise. They are ambitious, they're rigorous, but they really are well aligned with what other countries expect their young people to know and be able to do. So on that score, yes, there's alignment between current US policy and lessons learned from other countries. A second kind of development, if you will, or initiative is the one that really is now pushing hard to strengthen our teacher evaluation systems and to try to build some form of evidence of student learning into the way we evaluate and assess teachers. And while I totally accept the notion that our teacher evaluation system is broken, this is moving us in a direction which I think is very different from the direction in which other countries are moving. Among other things, this will require us to do even more testing than we are now doing, because only 18% of teachers currently are teaching in subjects and grade levels where this kind of data is even currently available. And if you really want to move toward a system where you are evaluating every teacher every year on the basis of evidence of student learning, and if the major source of evidence of student learning that we have are the standardized tests, and given the highly variable quality, to be polite, of our current tests, I think this is not a recipe for progress. The third element of the current government strategy is support for charter schools, an attempt to kind of reduce the barriers to create more competition, if you will, into the system. And again, I'm certainly the agnostic, if you will, on the question of charter schools. There are some wonderful, wonderful charter schools. There are some charter management organizations that run effective sets of schools. But the evidence we have to date is that on balance, charters are no better, at least in terms of student achievement, than kind of garden variety schools run by school districts. And while other high-performing countries often have elements of choice built into them, what they don't have is this attempt to kind of introduce kind of a disruptive strategy, if you will, into the larger system. Their focus is on continuously improving the larger system, focusing on the system as a whole and not attempting to kind of influence it from the outside, if you will. And finally, the fourth strategy of the current federal department is to focus on turning around the lowest performing schools. And again, hard to argue against that. And I think if I can just back up for a second, when we think about the U.S. Education system as a whole, I think obviously it is highly variable. Our strongest suburban schools are every bit, I think, as good as competitors elsewhere. The huge problem that we have is this enormous variability. The fact that we have 20% of our young people coming from families that are living in poverty. There are a set of kind of social conditions and a set of challenges that U.S. schools face, especially in our largest cities, that other systems with more kind of equitable social structures simply don't face. In Finland, 4% of kids come from families in poverty, a significant difference. So the problem of we, in a sense, no one else has quite the same problem at the same magnitude that we do of really trying to figure out strategies for really helping the schools with the highest concentrations of low-income kids and kids of color get better. But again, if you look to our neighbor to the north, to Canada, which for comparison purposes, if you look at Ontario, for example, 5,000 schools, a quarter of its school population, kids born in other countries, about a quarter of its population, kids sort of recognizably of color. And they have some of the same structures that we have in place. They do have a kind of external accountability system with some form of assessment and accountability. But their strategy for addressing their lowest performing schools is to kind of flood those schools with intervention and support, not with threats. Closing those schools is simply not an option on the table when you talk to Ontario policymakers. And in the period since the current government has been in place since 2003, they have radically reduced the number of schools whose kids are achieving well below standard. So that's a kind of quick look at a kind of comparison between the strategies from higher performing countries than ours. I now want to shift to a report that I referenced that was issued about a year ago with two colleagues, an economist named Ron Ferguson, a journalist named Bill Simons. What we were interested in doing, again from a kind of comparative perspective, is to look at how the US does with kids who are, for whatever set of reasons, not completing college. The jumping off point for our report was to say, let's shift from looking at how our students are doing at age 15 to how our young people are doing at age 25. Only about 30% of young Americans in their mid-20s have a bachelor's degree. Another 10% have an associate's degree. And although this slide doesn't particularly pick it up, our best estimate is that about another 10% of young people have some form of occupational certificate, one-year certificate typically from a community college, that actually has value in the labor market. That's 50% of our young people. The question we wanted to ask is, what's our strategy in this economy for actually helping the other half of our young people get the skills and credentials that they will need to be able to function? Nick mentioned our higher education system. At the very top of our system, obviously, it's world-class. Our graduate schools, professional schools continue to be magnets for talent from all over the world. But if you actually look at what our graduation rates are, for those who start off in a four-year institution, only 56% complete within 6 years. Two-year institutions, it's a different challenge because these are multi-purpose institutions serving a variety of purposes. But even when you look at the typical age cohort coming out of high school, their completion rates within 3 years are only 29%. I think, as we all know, if you look from 1970 and going forward, kind of projecting into the future, increasingly the projections coming from the Georgetown Center on Education and the Workforce suggest that by 2018, 63% of all jobs will require some form of post-secondary education or credential, compared to only 28% in 1972. But the important point that we focus on is that sometimes there's a tendency to think that the economy is being bifurcated into high skills and low skills, and the only choices are, bachelor's degree or beyond, or, you're consigned to a lifetime of low-wage, low-skill employment. What this slide tells us is that roughly 30% of the jobs projected going forward are really kind of middle-skilled jobs, jobs that will require some education beyond high school, but not necessarily a baccalaureate degree. A lot of those jobs require solid mathematics and science foundation. These are technical jobs, but these are jobs that can be a good kind of ladder, first step on a ladder leading you to kind of a middle-class wage in which you can support a family. We hear a lot today about the mismatch between the 14 million people unemployed while we have 3 million jobs sitting vacant, and typically that mismatch has to do with the lack of people with the skills required to fill those jobs. On that score, interestingly, one consequence of this report that we issued is that a lot of states have begun to ask us to come talk with them and meet with them and see if we can help them figure out strategies to address this kind of mismatch challenge. And I guess it was back in December we came up and spent some time at the invitation of the governor here in Maine, in Augusta, in a room full of chief executive officers from 25 companies from around the state. And the most recent job statistics that have been released just before we got here suggested there was almost an equal number of job-seeking people and people seeking work in the state. In other words, the mismatch was much less, was much closer than this one. Just one more kind of slide here, which was kind of implicit in one of the earlier slides. But what you can see is that for the first time, really, the percentage of people with college credentials, this generation is less well off than the previous generation. We have slipped essentially from 4th to 12th in this kind of comparative look at. And just to bring one more point home, I think as you all know, the people who've been most vulnerable in this economy are young people without skills and without training. In just 2 years, from November of 2007 to November of 2009, what you see is that 16 to 19-year-old unemployment rate increased by almost 25%, 10% increase among those from 20 to 24. This is the comparative point that we really wanted to make in this report. Bill Clinton used to say we're the only industrialized country that has no organized strategy to help young people get from high school to work other than through our formal higher education system. All across Northern Europe, and it's too small to see here, but the big headline is from the Netherlands, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Denmark, Finland, Sweden. In all of those countries, between 40 and 70% of young people by the middle of high school, typically around the age of 16, move into highly structured programs that really link learning at the workplace and applied academic learning in schools. These programs, and my wife and I had the opportunity to work on a very interesting OECD study that was released about a year ago called Learning for Jobs. A look at how 15 countries help their young people move from high school to work. And I just want to say a few things about what the main characteristics of these kind of mixed work and learning systems are. First, they align academic and technical preparation. Some are mostly school-based, some are mostly work-based. But even in the school-based programs, typically at least 6 months is spent in a kind of internship at the workplace. These systems have very strong employer involvement. Employers, they are driven by the broad needs of the economy. In Switzerland and Germany, over 25% of employers participate in these programs. They cover a very broad range of occupations, not just the traditional skilled trades or crafts. Obviously, a heavy focus on manufacturing, but white collar as well as blue collar, high tech as well as low tech occupations. Because they serve such a large proportion of young people, these are really mainstream programs designed to serve a broad range of kids with a broad range of skills. You may have noticed that Switzerland was right near the top on the International assessment of mathematics learning. Something like 42% of kids in the Finnish vocational system are in the top 2 performance categories on the PISA mathematics assessment. In other words, these are not programs for kids who are seen as not able to do academic work. They cover, again, a very broad range of young people as well as occupations. These programs evolve out of a social partnership, a public-private partnership, if you will. Yes, employers have a major role, but so do trade unions, so does government, and so do the educators. And they're designed in such a way to make sure that the skills that young people get in these programs are transferable. The young people, as the Europeans say, they own the skills, the company doesn't own them, so that they can take them and move along, not just inside a company, but can transfer laterally to other sectors if they choose. The other, and this comes back again to one of the themes in yesterday afternoon's conversation, these programs are the product of a kind of social contract between the adult society and its young people. They're based on the premise that young people need a lot of support to make this transition, not simply to move from school to work, but from adolescence to adulthood. And these are really reflective of a broader societal commitment to the kind of socialization and development of the young. Just a last couple of comments, and then I want to be able to move to questions. What are the results of these programs? First, significantly higher high school graduation rates. The countries in the upper right-hand quadrant have both the highest proportion of their kids in high-quality vocational education and get the highest graduation rates. Actually, I'll back up before we get to that one. Much lower youth unemployment. You may have seen a powerful story in the front page of the New York Times just a couple of days ago about the kids in England, where they're currently facing 22% youth unemployment. A pretty devastating story about even kids with college degrees really struggling in this labor market. There was a graph in the second part of that story that showed at the top of the pyramid, it was youth unemployment rates. Greece, Italy, Spain, unemployment rates of near 50% for 16 to 24-year-olds. England, 22%, the US, 8%. Switzerland, Germany, Austria, Netherlands, single-digit youth unemployment. And that has something to do with these systems. The last point I'd make relative to that is that thinking about Clyde Prestowitz's discussion about manufacturing and what it is that we're making, these countries with low unemployment rates and with very high investment in the development of young people also still have robust manufacturing economies. And I think those two things have something to do with one another. I think I'll stop at that point, Nick, and since I've run over a bit, and open up for questions.
Oh, got it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bob, thank you for a very fine, illuminating, discouraging in some ways set of figures, but thank you for that presentation. We'll take 15 minutes. There's a lot to talk about. We have a question right here. Yes.
Yes, Dan Dibner from Rockport. First of all, thank you very much for coming, a very interesting dialogue. Finland, it's mentioned many times.
Right.
The population of Finland is 5 million people in total.
Right.
The population of K through 12 students in the United States is 55 million. In all of Finland, there are fewer teachers than the city of New York. In fact, when we look at the students in Finland, there are only less than 600,000 students in all of Finland. The frustration level in the country is rising as it relates to education and educators. The concern I have is this: America has spent a fortune on education, America has focused on it, and somehow, through the distillation of the money through the current education system, there's a disconnect in actual performance. There have been substantive changes In the nature of students in K through 12, our numbers are massive, difficult to compare to nations as small as Finland. Would you take a second, please, and talk about the impact of unions in education?
Sure. Let me make 2 points. First, in terms of Finland, when you think about particularly these European countries, think of this as the United States of Europe. Finland ought to be compared with a state. 5.5 million people, that's about as many people as something like 30 of our states actually have. So yes, you can't compare Finland to the US, but we have a state-based system. And the question is, why can't we learn at the state level from some of what Finland does? In terms of unions, and it is striking, virtually every high-performing country that I've looked at has a strong national teachers organization. I know it's easy to kind of vilify unions. I've worked in some places where I thought the unions were a significant part of the problem, but we have a whole region of the country that's basically ununionized. Take a look at, ask yourself, is performance any better in the southern states that don't have collective bargaining requirements than it is everywhere else in the country? So I think that scapegoating the unions is too easy an answer.
So, Bob, another question we hear a lot about is how much is declining performance a function of teaching? How much a function of what's happening in our families?
Yeah, this is a really tough one. We've had this actually in the run-up to the Democratic Convention a few years ago. There was this two kind of competing policy statements, both obviously competing for the attention of the next president. One arguing that schools can do it by themselves, no excuses. The other arguing, until you fix the problems of poverty, not fair to expect the schools to be able to overcome these gaps in achievement. And I think it's the old story. This has to be both and. I mean, I think my bias here is that, well, obviously we all know examples both of individuals who have overcome the odds, of whole classrooms that have overcome the odds, and of schools that have overcome the odds. At the system level, it's pretty hard to imagine how if we rely on schools only to address the growing income inequality and other forms of inequality in the society, I think that's too big a burden to put on the schools by themselves. I think this is a larger societal issue. That's not to let the schools off the hook. I used to say to my students, if you're a teacher or a principal and you walk in the door every morning in your classroom in particular, you have to blot out everything. Your job is to, in the few hours a day that you've got those kids, is to make sure that you equip them with the kind of foundation of literacy and numeracy and thinking skills and reasoning skills. No excuses allowed. But in your role as a citizen, you've got to speak up pretty loudly about getting the rest of the society to address these really huge and growing income inequality issues.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Mac DeFord. The question I have relates to salaries of teachers, and whether it's Finland or other Northern European countries, or Canada for that matter, how do their salaries relate in absolute terms to American salaries of teachers, or in relative terms compared to how they would pay their professors at university or their lawyers for that matter?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think the relative question is the relevant one, if you will. That is, what's the status of teachers vis-a-vis other professions? And I think, in Finland, it's very interesting. If you poll high school kids in Finland and ask about the status of professions, teaching is right up there with medicine. At the starting level, salaries really are not much different in comparative terms than ours. The smart systems, however, do reward people for staying in the long term. Other countries do not have anything. The high-performing countries don't have anything like the attrition problems that we have, where pretty close to 50% of our teachers leave within the first 5 years. Part of that has to do with the kind of support systems for teachers. Part of it, Singapore, for example, has 3 different tracks if you come into teaching. You can stay in teaching, get better, and have increased responsibilities. You can move into a kind of specialty, assessment, technology, research, or you can move into administration and ultimately aspire to be a superintendent. But at the top of those tracks, the salaries are parallel. So the great master teacher who's affecting other teachers in that system can earn as much as the superintendent of the largest school system.
Captain Porter made the point yesterday that our school year is based on the 19th century agricultural patterns of life in the United States. Should our kids be in school till July? Should they go to school for 8 hours a day, 9 hours a day? Should we do away with after-school sports and stress academics? Most European high schools have no tradition of athletics. They focus on academics.
Yeah, that's, again, a really good question. I think we're now beginning to accumulate a lot of evidence, both from the most effective charter schools and from other experiments going on, that particularly for kids coming from high poverty families, that extending the school day has lots of benefits, but it's the old story. It depends what you do with that extra time. The extra time by itself is not magic. Kids in Finland actually go to school fewer days and fewer hours than our kids. Actually, I've seen one study that says that Italian kids by the end of compulsory schooling have been in school the equivalent of 3 more years than Finnish kids, and yet so a lot really, to me, the core question is really the quality of teaching. It's not the time by itself.
Interesting. Yes.
Nate Wiles from the University of Maine. There's been a theme over this whole weekend about how to bypass ineffective institutions, whether it's Congress or a small governing body. And so I'd be curious, you mentioned Arnie Duncan as an individual and somebody who you say is doing a good job. I wonder if you could speak to the Department of Education as a whole and how effective it's been over the last really century and moving forward. But more importantly, what can we do in this room to bypass the ineffective institutions that exist today?
Or to remake them.
Yeah. Well, first, on the Department of Education, it's really only existed as a department since 1979. Historically, the Department of Education had a very limited set of functions. It was basically statistics gathering. And it's really only been in this last decade or so that we've seen a really aggressive federal role. And I think one consequence of No Child Left Behind is that there's now a kind of recognition that maybe we need to peel that back a bit and acknowledge the fact that education in this country is essentially a state responsibility, and try to figure out what the right balance of power is between states and localities. On the institution question, again, I'd simply try to reiterate the theme that we heard from our military folks yesterday, is that there just has to be much more kind of civic engagement, which also opens up a question that came up yesterday about what's the role of the kind of the civic function of education. I think of schools as having essentially 3 responsibilities, one of which obviously is to give all kids a solid academic foundation. But to prepare people for civic life is a critically important thing. And again, I'm encouraged by the show of students in this crowd, and I would simply argue, get engaged at the community level. If you don't like the way the institutions are functioning, change them.
Okay. We're going to try to take 2 more questions. One, I think, Jim, from a remote location. This is from Ron Jarvetta in Northport, Maine. Vouchers, charter schools, school choice. Are these measures to be viewed as an attack on public schools? Should we be seeking to privatize public education?
Well, first, charters are another form of public schools. I mean, they are privately managed, but these are public dollars and subject to public accountability. As I said before, this is not a strategy that other nations are pursuing. That's not to say that there aren't some potential benefits for us. I'm not a great fan of privatization. The public schools have historically been an important kind of socializing engine for this society, and I think we need to keep the focus on improving them.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Ron Bancroft from Cumberland. I want to go back to the question about unions and what's preventing us from getting systemic change. Yeah. One of the slightly disappointing things, Professor Schwartz, in what you laid out was you portray the problem well. You portray some potential from the systems that are doing well, but of course the systems that are doing well, as the other gentleman suggested, are smaller, more homogeneous. It's Correct. An easier problem. We seem to have a problem in this country in cracking the code on how you make systemic change. We've got some good schools, as you point out, but how do you get systemic change? And I would argue that What we need, and what all the research has showed, is we need qualified teachers, really good qualified teachers in every classroom. The problem with the union is they resist qualified teachers in every classroom and have resisted it consistently.
I don't think that's a fair rap to put on unions. I totally agree.
It certainly is a fair rap, particularly if you look at the evidence in the state of Maine. The teachers union has opposed anything that would allow us to have a better evaluation of teachers, to change the teachers' contract to allow more flexibility. In any case, it's not all the unions, because there certainly are problems with local governance. But I think you're really letting the teachers union off the hook here.
Thank you.
I
You get a right of reply. And Bob, this will be your final comment, so whatever you'd like to say to wrap up.
Sure.
please take that.
First, I absolutely want to underscore the goal here has to be a high-quality teacher in every classroom. And I do think that shortcuts into teaching is a significant problem here. We've somehow got to accept the fact that teaching is a profession. We've got to figure out a way to make the conditions of teaching such that strong people will not simply want to come in, and obviously I'm a huge fan of Teach for America and other organizations that have managed to get us a larger slice of the talent pool in the society come into teaching. But to come in with 6 months of training and stay for 2 years, think about how we would react if somebody said, oh yes, we're going to take kids right out of Yale and Princeton, train them for 6 weeks, and send them into the emergency rooms and hospitals for a couple of years because we're shortchanged, and then let them go on to their real careers, as hedge fund managers. I mean, it sends the wrong message. The last point I'd make about unions is, let's remember, union contracts are not set by the unions unilaterally. Management is on the other side of the table. We've got a huge problem with the fact that management in education has not taken seriously the requirement to actually make the tenure bar a serious bar. So guess what? We have a lot of people who wind up teaching, getting tenure, who we think maybe ought not to be there. To put that problem on the union is, to me, to really miss the point here. We've got to strengthen both sides of the equation. Whether we like it or not, we're going to have unions in education. We might like to be able to wipe the slate clean and say no, but we've got to figure out a strategy to work with teachers, not to demonize them. The last thing I'd say is that, in the situation we're moving into, what worries me most is that 3 things are going on. We have the Common Core standards have really raised the bar in terms of the expectations. The Common Core standards really rely on very ambitious instruction. What it means is that most teachers are going to have to learn some new things if they're going to be able to deliver on the goals of those standards. At the very same time, we are putting in place more stringent accountability systems for teachers, not a recipe for teachers to try new things, and we're trying to do this on the cheap because we have no money. Not a great recipe for success.
Bob, thank you.
On that grim note.
Yeah. Anything else you want to say?
No, thanks.
Thank you very, very much.